Bereishit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So begins this week's Torah portion. So begins the Torah. So begins the story of our people. The important contemporary scholar, Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler, observes in the Women's Torah commentary that the ancient Babylonian myth that strongly resembles Genesis 1 has one great dissimilarity from it. In that myth, creation begins with a murder. The goddess Tiamat, cognate to our word tehom, watery chaos. If you were here at the beginning, you will have heard it in the song that we began this morning's service. The goddess Tiamat is slain by the hero god Marduk, and the universe is carved out of her body. Violence there is inextricable from the process of creation, Rachel Adler writes. In Genesis 1, however, creation entails no destruction. Even the primal watery abyss is not completely obliterated, but lingers at the bottom of the sea, to reappear in many a psalm or story. The drawing of distinctions and boundaries that marks both accounts is in Genesis 1, peaceful and harmonious. God distinguishes elements of the original watery chaos by drawing boundaries between them and naming them, light and darkness, day and night. Created elements are not simple oppositions. They are both distinct and akin. And so we reach the moment of creation of humankind. Let's remind ourselves of the exact words used in Torah. Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar unekeva bara otam. And God created Adam in God's image. In the image of God, God created it. Male and female, God created them. Well, what is it, we might ask? Is one person created or two? In the Midrash, the rabbis, equally perplexed by the text, suggest that the first person was created with two faces and contained both a male and a female characteristic. According to this interpretation, the first human being began life not as he or she, but they. Some of you might now be thinking, how terribly woke of these rabbis 1,200 years ago. A plural pronoun for an individual? Is that not violence done to our language? There are many that use the creation story as a way to justify gender binaries. Doesn't it say clearly, zachar or nekeva, male and female? Undeniably so, but it also portrays other aspects of creations as binaries, even though our observance of the world clearly shows that things don't fit neatly into just two categories. For example, think about another binary mentioned in our creation story, day and night. What about sunrise and sunset, those magical twilight moments? Shall we deny their existence because they transcend binary categories? Importantly, the Bible has had to deal with an embedded grammatical pluralism ever since it came into being. That's because the word for God, Elohim, is a plural form in Hebrew. We see it used throughout the first creation story and the rest of the Tanakh with reference to both the Hebrew God and any other god or gods. The modern Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen called it an almost insoluble riddle. Despite our commentators offering a whole host of contradictory explanations for this grammatical pluralism, in reality, our tradition unquestioningly embraced the use of a plural noun in a singular context when discussing the most sacred, God's actions in the world. Far from considering this as an act of violence, the Jewish tradition embraces the grammatical pluralism of the word Elohim peacefully and harmoniously. Writing last week in the New York Times, linguistic professor John McWhorter waxed enthusiastic about the advent of they as our all-purpose third-person singular pronoun. Language change is a spectator sport, McWhorter writes. It isn't whether, but how things will change over time. And getting to witness a major change like what's happening today is a kind of privilege, a top ticket. But we are talking about something more important here than just about the privilege of witnessing our language change. We recognize today that it has been far too long that the individuals who identify as non-binary were denied not only a pronoun to describe themselves, but were far too often made to feel like there was no place for them, that they were in their own non-existent category for which no space was made in a world of binaries, male-female, boy-girl, man-woman, brother-sister. The statistics about trans and non-binary mental health in our society are deeply depressing. However, a 2016 study out of the University of Washington and published in Pediatrics promisingly found that gender non-conforming children aged 3 to 12 who were raised in socially affirming families showed rates of depression and anxiety more similar to their gender-conforming peers. In other words, as my colleague Rabbi Nikki DeBlosey highlights in her important article, Making Room for Day, supporting gender non-conforming children and adults in their own identity makes a huge difference in their long-term mental health. It was the maverick philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein who coined the term language game. He contended that words acquire meaning by their use and wanted to see how their use was tied up with the social practices of which they are a part. So he used language game to draw attention not only to language itself, but to the actions into which it is woven. For Wittgenstein, the language game is not simply a set of rules for the correct use of language. Language is a way of viewing the world and allows us to observe the world from new vantage points. The Cambridge philosopher Dr. Sandy Grant gives the example of the controversy over all-male speaker events. You can look at the lineup and say a panel of experts, or you can say a manel. But is it only a manel if you choose to see it that way, Dr. Grant asks? So adapting our language allows us to see the world with new eyes. We can use language to create more justice in the world, to reveal a world more peaceful and harmonious. Or we can use language to maintain existing power differentials, allowing it to do violence. I'm confident that if our people have been able to cope with the grammatical pluralism when it comes to the one, to God, I'm sure the Jewish community can rise to the challenge to adapt the language that we use to be inclusive of all Jews, irrespective of whether their pronouns are they, she, or he. For Genesis reminds us that we were all created bearing the tselem, the image, and the demut, the resemblance of the divine creator. Let us ensure that the language we use does justice to this truth. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.